So you've stumbled upon this video, and like me, maybe you've seen several other videos about these amazing diesel heaters, how efficient they are, how inexpensive they are to buy and run, and all of that is true. But what if you have a snowstorm, an ice storm, something that takes out power? How do you deal with that? How do you keep them running when you have no power in your house? That's what I want to deal with today, is how to run one of these diesel heaters in an off-grid situation, and then a couple of hints and tips about how to make them run as efficiently as possible. I do want to give a quick word of advice or warning before I get started here, and that's that I have a lot of training and understanding in electrical systems. So consider that there are some things that I'm doing that may or may not be exactly proper, because I'm trying to set up a system that will run in a off-grid scenario or a grid down scenario where exact specific connections might not be the top priority, but getting heat and warmth in your house is. So just keep that in mind and make sure that you're making decisions based on what's safe for you and your family, and based on your understanding of these systems. Basically, we've got black here is hot, and I've used my own MC4 connectors with a crimper, and then we've got white as the negative, and so inside we're going to follow that same pattern to make sure everything gets hooked up properly. So here's my 330 watt solar panel. It is set up and is running into the home right there, where you can see my exhaust and air intake are set up for the diesel heater, and so this is going to have a line running inside to charge the battery. So here's how I am venting my diesel heater. You can see the vent here. It's going through this, it's basically a thick flashing that I've used, and I've drilled a hole just the right size for the exhaust to go through. This exhaust gets really hot, so you want to make sure that there's a good separation between the exhaust and any potential flammable or meltable materials. And then I have my air intake here. You want to make sure that there's enough distance between the exhaust and the intake, that the intake air isn't pulling in a whole bunch of exhaust air. This is basically made, I cut it out to be the exact shape of the opening of the window, so I could close the window down on top of it and then keep it from leaking, air leaking around. And then you can also tape around that to reduce any potential air leaks. Here is the interior setup, and here's my battery and wiring configuration. You can see this is totally separate to itself. It's not connected to the home wiring at all. First of all, you've got your wire in from the solar panels. This may look a little bit thin, but because of the distance I'm running and the amperage I'm running, it's actually okay in this case. And they run to these lever nuts, which I'm a big fan of these lever nuts for any time when you are needing to swap something out for testing or for temporary use. So I'll have a link to those in the description. Those run to this, it's called a buck converter, and it's a DC to DC converter. On the back of these buck converters, it has listings for the input and output voltages and which wire is which. So you can see the negative wire there and positive wire there are the black wire and the red wire. So that helps us keep our orientation right, even if our wire colors coming in are different in some way. And then, so that's the input. You can see the device is labeled with that being the input. And then the output is here. That's the yellow is positive, the black is negative, with a 13.8 volt output and 20 amp output. That's important, and I'll go over these specs in a minute, but the total output wattage of this device is 276 watts. You get that by multiplying the output voltage and the output amperage. And that's just Ohm's law, something that's really good to know and understand. But this cheap DC to DC converter, or buck converter, which I will also put a link to a couple different versions of that, is really helpful. One of the things to note is that the input voltage says 36 volts to 48 volts. This specific item is actually listed as a 30 to 90 volt input. So these buck converters can usually take a pretty significant range of different inputs from whatever your input device is. And then they convert it down to what would nominally be considered 12 volts, but it's a 13.8 volt. You can see that right there. And there's a really important reason for that. If it were at 12 volts, it wouldn't charge the battery properly. And if you had to pull a lot of amperage from it and it dropped the voltage slightly, then it wouldn't continue to work properly, or the device connected to it wouldn't continue to work properly. So this 13.8 volts on the output actually allows me to charge typical car batteries. This one's a gel battery, recycled gel battery that I got, but it can also charge AGM batteries. So it's a great float voltage for charging batteries, and that's really important. So that being said, the output right here, the 13.8 volts, we've got our positive lead coming again to these lever nuts, and our negative lead coming to the lever nuts. Now, these lever nuts basically just connect everything that's inside of them. So these leads, the positive and negative, are simultaneously charging the battery and providing power. So you've got your positive power, negative power out to our diesel heater. And so that diesel heater is primarily running off of the battery, but then the battery is being charged by this, and it's actually all tied together with these output lever nuts. So here is the input from the solar panel, and I've plugged my multimeter into it, so you can see I've just clamped those down on the wire nuts, or lever nuts, and you can see the voltage coming in from the panels. It is fluctuating a bit because it's pretty cloudy out, so that voltage is being, or the power from those panels is being used pretty much at full capacity. And so that is just showing you that my input voltage to the buck converter is about 56 volts. Now if I move these over to these leads, it should be somewhere around 12 volts to 13.8 volts. So now I've moved these leads over to the output. So that's the output of the buck converter here. And you can see it's at 12 volts, between 12 and 12.1. What will happen over time is as the solar panels charge the battery through the buck converter, this voltage will actually go up. So over the day, as long as there's sun shining, that will increase over time until the voltage is floating at 13.8 volts. Now we're obviously using some for the diesel heater, and that means that it's always going to be a little bit lower than 13.8 because that's our float voltage. So that is what's going on with this. That's how all of that works. The last bit that I wanted to add is that I use a low wattage control charger from the wall. So this system will keep me going when power is out. However, when power is running, I like to use it just in case we have low sunshine input from the solar panels. So that way I've got just a constant low charge even at night, so I make sure I don't run out of power. But this is set up so that if this system doesn't work, we are still able to run the system all day and all night because of the battery. And then as far as calculations on the battery, this specific unit uses about 10 watts of power when it's running. So this device is about a 11 watt output, which is about perfect. But that means that when you calculate what you need for a battery to get through the night, you have to calculate your hours and watt usage. And you can do that with Ohm's law, but basically if I'm using 10 watts on this, that means I'm using, let's say it's 12 watts to calculate a little bit high. That means I'm using 1 amp hour at 12 volts. So at 12 volts, I'm using 1 amp hour. And if I need this battery to run overnight, then I need to calculate the number of amp hours. So if I calculate this out, this system is going to need 12 amp hours to get me through the night. But most batteries are really only dischargeable to about 50% rate of discharge, so I'm going to need 24 amp hours. On startup, these things, it's a very short startup, but they draw quite a bit more wattage, It seems like right around 200 or 300 watts. So I'm going to need to increase that even more. So to be safe, you'll want a battery with at least 40 amp hours to get you through each night, and to make sure that when it gets recharged during the day, it's able to function the way that it needs to all night long. And that's assuming 12 hours of dark and that you have enough sun during the day to recharge this. So just keep in mind that there's some factors there where you may want a bigger battery to get you through a few cloudy days as well. So when you put all the factors together, such as wanting a couple of days of runtime without good sunlight, and wanting to make sure to accommodate for the 50% rate of discharge, I would generally recommend about 100 amp hour battery, 100 amp hour rated battery for this setup. Here are a couple of tips to make this as efficient as possible. You can see that I have my air intake actually going outside, as well as my exhaust going outside. One of the common mistakes that I see made is that this air intake is actually left on the inside of the home. And what that does is it creates a negative air pressure or a negative air pressure differential in the home, meaning that you're pulling air from in the home, it's going into the system, and then that air that's going into the system for combustion comes back out. And so you're basically have a fan pushing air out, and that makes a negative pressure or a differential, so that then air needs to come into the home to basically take the place of the air that you're pushing out. And obviously that's going to make things colder in the home, or reduce the amount of heat that you actually end up, the net heat that you actually end up generating. Some people will put these devices outside and then just run this vent through the wall and in. Now that's okay as long as you have a cover over the heater itself. However, what will happen is if you're pulling air from outside and pushing it in, you're going to create a positive air differential. And that means that air inside the house will find ways to push out, and then you're pulling in cooler air and pulling in cooler air from outside that has to be heated further, and you're pushing out the hot air from inside the house. So if you were to put one of these outside under cover, what you need to do is have an inlet from the house running out to this device, to that inlet there, and then this would run back in, so you have a closed loop into the house. Those two things are major mistakes that I see people making in setting these up. And then the other thing that I like to mention is obviously you want to put this as central to the house as you can, but if it needs to go near an exterior wall, that may not be highly practical. So you can run the outlet towards a fan, and then your fan can actually help blow that hot air towards the rest of the home. So we use a HEPA filter since we run that in our house anyways, but it is easy way to get the heat from this device over and out to and distribute it throughout the home. So to simplify things for you, I put together this diagram. It's not perfectly accurate, but it should give you a really good simplified idea of what this system is supposed to look like. You should have a solar panel. That solar panel is going to have an output voltage. That output voltage needs to be matched with the buck converter here. So the output voltage from the panel and the buck converter need to match together. That's fairly simple. I'll leave some links for buck converter options in the description. And then you can see that the buck converter then has an output to the battery. That output needs to be a 13.8 volt output. Do not get the 12 volt output buck converters. It will not work for charging your battery. It won't bring your battery up to the proper voltage. The buck converter then helps charge the battery, and then the diesel heater runs off of the battery that's being charged by the buck converter. Now, I am recommending a 100 amp hour 12 volt battery for running a diesel heater if you're doing it specifically for preparedness and keeping your home warm during a power outage. That's the whole point of this video. And in that case, you're going to have some days with low or no sun, because if you have an outage, it's likely to be very cloudy from storms. So I'm going to recommend a 100 amp hour 12 volt battery It works well with the buck converter and panel systems that I have suggested, and it will keep your heater running for as long as you need it to. If you have any questions, if you need anything else, feel free to reach out to me or just write a comment in the comments and I'll get back to you. You can find a ton more useful videos on similar things. I'm going to be covering the whole setup that we just looked at here, but minus the diesel heater and some of the other things that we can actually hook to this battery to make the system work properly for other backup needs. So there's a lot you can do with this, and if you do end up getting that 100 amp hour battery, it can run a lot of other things as well. So I hope you found this helpful. If you need anything, reach out. You can also find more information or get in contact with me through my website, thehomesteadconsultant.com, and I help people set up homesteads and resilient systems to weather the storm. Thanks for watching.